Greetings folks, and welcome to another episode of 81632-bit. As you've already guessed from the title today, I'm looking at some controversial titles for the 16-bit systems. Now, I'm going to be looking at 3 titles specifically here today, which were instrumental in some Congress hearings in the US, which ultimately led to the introduction of the American ESRB and the European PEGI rating system. So today we'll be taking a look at Mortal Kombat, Lethal Enforcers, and the bête noire of those who were against video game violence, Night Trap. So without further ado, let's get into the first of those games. Now, the first of these games is Midway's Mortal Kombat, which, as you can see here, features digitised sprites, and on the Mega Drive version, again as you can see, featured the blood and gore from the arcade, although you did have to input a code on a special screen to access this blood. Now, this was considered something outrageous at the time because video games, very much so in the early 1990s, were still heavily viewed as a kid's hobby. So this kind of realistic, and I use that word advisedly, violence, showed that games were becoming more mature. Now, as I said, you could see here the Mega Drive version was basically the fully featured version of Mortal Kombat once you added in the relatively easy code on the code screen, which gave you the blood, it gave you the game's fatalities, for which it was infamous, where you'd see things like people's spinal cord ripped down, heads torn off, people set on fire. And the game was also released on the Super Nintendo, which, as you can see here, does look a little more realistic, but the blood has been replaced by sweat, and because of Nintendo's practices at the time, they couldn't even include the blood as a cheat mode. This was what you got, and obviously the Mega Drive version proved to be far more popular because of this. Now, Mortal Kombat was massively hyped, and at the time was certainly one of the biggest games to be released for both the Mega Drive and Super Nintendo, and as such, this really caught the eye of those who wanted these kind of games outlawing. Now, Mortal Kombat may have looked quite real, but it wasn't the only game of the time on these systems to feature digitised sprites, and that's what we're going to take a look at next with Lethal Enforcers. Now, much like Mortal Kombat, Lethal Enforcers began life in the arcades as a light gun shooter. Now, for some reason, in this period of the 16-bit life cycle, light guns became popular home devices, and Konami released Lethal Enforcers on both the Super Nintendo and the Mega Drive, and they also released their own light gun, the Justifier. Now, whilst the quote-unquote realistic digitised graphics were, again, like Mortal Kombat, they were filmed from real actors and such, so they had an element of realism that previous games had lacked, they still didn't look particularly realistic, really. The low colour depth, graininess and jerkiness of the animation certainly put paid to that. What really hurt Lethal Enforcers and really drew the ire of those wanting to ban video games or regulate them was the fact that even though they were pink and blue, the Justifier light guns looked like real 44 Magnums, and there was a belief held by some that this would promote violent behaviour. Now, whether you want to believe this or not is up to you. What I can say is Lethal Enforcers very clearly is not an accurate representation of the real world or what happens when you shoot people. Just look at it. This is the Mega Drive version here. It looks terrible. The SNES version, which you saw before, does look a touch more realistic, but this really is not a realistically violent game or a realistic looking game in any real sense of the word. And now we come to the big one, the bête noire of the video game violence debate, Night Trap. Now, again, like the previous two mentioned games, this game featured real actors. However, unlike Mortal Kombat and Lethal Enforcers, where the real actors were digitised and turned into animated sprites, Night Trap used full motion video. This was the first time in the home that full motion video had been used in video games. Yes, in the arcades there had been titles like Dragon's Lair where animation had been streamed off laser discs, but this was in your home. You were controlling the video, and this really got those conservatives who felt that video games were just children's toys really angry. Now, a lot of them misinterpreted what the game was about. They felt that the game was about attacking young women and putting them into gruesome situations, which wasn't the truth. The point of the game was to protect the young women in the game from the vampires. Now, this was done, as I said, through full motion video with you controlling the cameras in the house. But frankly, as you can see, the quality of the full motion video at the time was terrible. This was using such an incredibly low bit rate. It just looked grainy. It was sub VHS level. And again, nobody could mistake this for reality. It's very clearly a filmed production. It looks a bit cheap and nasty. The video quality is awful. And there is not a chance on this earth that this game would drive anyone to commit any crimes. But the controversy surrounding this, Lethal Enforcers and Mortal Kombat, was very real. Hell, at the congressional hearings, Nintendo of America's then President Howard Lincoln stated that you would never see games like this on a Nintendo system. Yet here we are some 30 years later, and I have a copy of Night Trap on my Switch. So, you know, changing attitudes and all of that. But this was controversy, and it was because of these games being debated in US Congress that we ended up with the ESRB and in Europe, PEGI. Games became rated. People stopped viewing video games as just something for kids, or rather, some people did. A lot of people just carrying on, assuming games were for kids and getting upset at adult-rated games. And hey, even though there's ratings, doesn't mean people pay attention. We've all been there in a video game store where we've seen an adult purchasing a copy of something like GTA 5 for a kid, the store staff saying, hey, you know, this isn't for kids, and the parent going, but it's just a video game. That was what was the driver of these controversies, and that's what will remain the driver of controversies about video game violence until the end of video games. And there we have it, folks. 3 controversial video games that from the 16-bit era that had a real impact on where video games are today and their perception. Now, what do you think? Do you think the stress about video game violence is justified? Or do you think it's just another way of politicians to get publicity and drive themselves through and keep themselves in office? Let me know in the comments down below. Obviously, if you've enjoyed this video, do hit the like button. If you've really enjoyed it, do hit the subscribe button as well to subscribe to the channel. You can ring the bell to be notified when I upload new videos. Don't forget, you can also take out a YouTube membership if you really enjoy it. You can go and join my Patreon page and become a member there. You can even just leave me a one-off donation on Coffee if you want. It's all up to you. Now, I've been Rob. This has been 81632-bit. I'm going to give a shout out once again to Leftback and Old Scott Retro for supporting the channel. And I will see them and you on the next video. So long.